Good afternoon, and thanks for joining ADAR and the Australian Red Cross for this webinar, Recovery Uncovered, the first year collaborating for community recovery. My name's Erin Pelly, and I'm the National Manager at Australian Red Cross for Recovery, and I'm delighted to be your host today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Wiradjuri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people, their ongoing culture and connection to the lands and waterways across Australia. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands you're all joining from today. And if you could put that in the chat and we can see where you're all joining from. I would also like to just shout out that next week is the first ever National Indigenous Disaster Resilience Gathering in Lismore. So you should check out the website and see what's happening next week. Very exciting. Now, just some housekeeping before we begin. We are recording today's webinar and it will be available on the ADAR website after the event. We'll be using the Q&A function on Zoom. So down the bottom, you can see there's a chat box and then there's also a Q&A feature. So please post your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat window. You'll also be able to upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and I'll do my best to ask as many as possible once our speakers have their conversation today. I encourage you to use the chat window to share your thoughts or reflections during the presentations. But just a reminder to please be respectful and kind to each other and our presenters when posting your comments today. This is the fourth webinar of the Recovery Uncovered series presented by the Disaster Recovery Mentors hosted by ADAR and Australian Red Cross. Disaster Recovery Mentors is a mentoring program coordinated by the Australian Red Cross. It's aimed at supporting disaster-affected communities, their leaders and practitioners who support them in their recovery. The aim of the program is to support community-led recovery. The Recovery Uncovered webinar series is being designed to provide recovery workers and practitioners with insights into disaster recovery from a community perspective. We will be sharing disaster recovery lessons from the emergency management and disaster resilience sector using a combination of lived experience, storytelling, as presented by the disaster recovery mentors, with complementary research, practical advice, and information presented by researchers. In today's session, we'll be joined by disaster recovery mentors Dan O'Hara and Dan Long, who will be drawing from research and their practical experiences to discuss the importance and complexities of collaboration in recovery and working across multiple agencies. They'll also provide some tips on how new and established organisations can work better together and share their experiences with collaboration. Before we get started, please join me in welcoming our speakers for today. Our first speaker, Dan O'Hara, is dialing in from Tasmania today. She has over 10 years of experience in disaster resilience and recovery, including with Red Cross, coordinating the Australian Red Cross Blue Mountains Recovery Program in 2014. And supporting Australian-wide state teams to deliver disaster recovery programs through coordination, planning, training, M&E, and implementation advice. She's also researching her PhD on topics such as interagency collaboration in disaster recovery, community engagement, recovery and social change, as well as understanding and navigating conflict. She's currently working as a regional recovery coordinator at the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Tasmania. She's also a consultant designing and delivering training, resources, workshops and group processes, and providing advice and mentoring to NGOs, local government and state government. In addition to her disaster-related experience, Dan has worked across other sectors, developing relevant skills such as community engagement, facilitation, training, strategic programming, research and evaluation. And if she's not already got her hands full from all those things, she's also a disaster recovery mentor. Welcome, Dan. Our second speaker for today is Dan Long, who's worked for the Blue Mountain City Council for approximately 20 years and has dealt with a number of natural disasters and extreme weather events from an operational perspective, including fires, windstorm, sand, and snow. As the manager of open space and recreation for the Blue Mountain City Council, Dan is engaged with a wide range of stakeholders. Following the October 2013 fires, where approximately 200 homes were destroyed, Dan was the bushfire recovery manager, where his role included developing a recovery action plan in consultation with a wide range of stakeholders, both government, NGO, and community, as well as setting up the local community recovery reference group and local community recovery steering committee. In addition, he's worked across the social and wellbeing, rebuild, economic, and environmental working groups. And his role also played a massive part in the debrief process for the Blue Mountain City Council, where they celebrated the successes and identified areas for improvement. This led to the creation of a preparedness toolkit for the organisation. Welcome, Dan O, and welcome, Dan L. Really looking forward to the discussion on collaboration today. I'll now pass over to Dan O.
It's going to be endless comedy today. Thank you for the intro, Erin. I join you from Nipaluna, Hobart, and I pay respect to the traditional and original owners of the land, the Muwinina people, and acknowledge today's Tasmanian Aboriginal community as the continuing custodians of this island on which I live. Dan and I are going to be fairly informal today. So we aren't going to deliver a PowerPoint presentation. We are going to have a conversation with one another. So we have some pre-prepared questions we're going to ask one another, but we might also pause, ask one another to expand on something or to elaborate or to explain or provide an example. And we're doing this really deliberately. So it's our intention to try and kind of model good collaborative relationships by having a two-way conversation and by asking questions of one another and listening to one another. And so as you will already know, although my name is Danielle, I often also get called Dan, including by Dan, but I'm sure you will work out what's happening as we go. So I am going to kick off with a question for Dan. And it is, how did you start working in recovery and why are you still here? So I understand the chat box provided some background, but really just a bit of an orientation.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And yeah, it is going to be a bit of a comedy today, I think. And it's really, really important as well that we do have a little bit of humor when we're working in this space, because yeah, it's not always possible, but where there is time to do that, it's always great. Yeah, as was mentioned, I really kind of fell into the recovery space accidentally. It was the 2013 Blue Mountains bushfires. We lost around 200 houses. Originally, I was operating in a really operational kind of role, supporting the RFS here at Council. But then a key member of staff went on some long-term and long-planned leave. And therefore, I was asked by the GM at the time if I'd want to step into his role. And he played a key role in dealing with a range of different stakeholders and that kind of community recovery space. So that then led me to step into that role, and then I was assigned the bushfire recovery manager role, which was a funded role through the state government at the time for a period of 18 months. And that's in fact where I first came into contact with yourself, Dan, as you know, you were working for Red Cross at the time, and yeah, we set up a really good little team, and we worked very, very closely together in trying to pick through the range of community challenges that we had. And I really do thank the Red Cross at that period of time, because they did provide a whole range of tools to council, things like communicating in recovery and other things, so that we could actually work really well with those community groups, and working with a group of people who probably hadn't been through this before and didn't have that skill set. I was one of them. So yeah, it was really good to have that support. I think you know, why am I still doing this? Why am I still in this space? I mean, it's not my role at the moment. As I said, I manage you know, the parks and sports grounds, the open space and rec kind of areas for Blue Mountains Council at the moment. But I did feel I could, you know, really help out the organisation ongoing. And also I was approached by Chris Newton and Steve Pascoe when they were setting up the original disaster recovery mentors for Red Cross. And of course, yeah, I thought I've got something to give back. Had a lot of support in doing this, so I can certainly do that. And I thought I could make a difference and try and help out. So yeah, I jumped onto that, and I've been linked in with a number of different mentees across my time. I've always said, if you want to talk about community development or anything like that, there's probably a whole range of other mentors you can choose other than me, because that's not my specialty. But if you need someone to try and help pick through the you know, the intricacies of local government and the bureaucracy of local government, you know, I can certainly help out in that space in this type of area, because that's you know, I was obviously working through a lot of that here at Blue Mountains Council. So I think I am one of the kind of local government experts as a mentor. So and I've also now been asked to be on the steering committee as well. So I've been on the steering committee for the drama group for around about 12 months. And again, that's really, really interesting. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And yeah, if I can ask you the same question back, Dan, how did you start working in recovery and why are you still here?
Good question. So as you mentioned, so I started working in recovery after the 2013 Blue Mountains bushfires. My background was in community engagement and community development, but more from an environmental and conservation background. And I was co-located with Blue Mountains City Council for 2 years. And as Dan mentioned, I think that was really crucial to the collaboration working effectively. Just physically being located in the same space provides such an opportunity to understand how different agencies operate and identify opportunities to work together. And since that time, I've worked in various roles, as you will have seen from the chat box. And I'm still mostly here kind of by accident as well. So, you know, there are 3 things that are really important to me when it comes to work, that it's meaningful, that it uses my skills, and that I'm challenged and continue to learn. And working in recovery certainly does that. And it teaches me about recovery, but also through affected communities and through my colleagues, I learn about, you know, about myself, about the world, about how our communities operate, and about important things like collaboration. Yeah, and as Erin mentioned, I'm doing a PhD at the moment on conflict in disaster recovery collaborations. So it is a topic that I'm really interested in and passionate about. And I think that question of how can we work better together is really crucial to making recovery work as well as it can. So, Dan, I have another question for you. And it is, do you have a recent example of recovery work that has involved collaboration?
Yeah, look, absolutely do. And if anyone knows the Blue Mountains, you know that we are a beautiful area, but we do face a number of extremes, you know, whether it's bushfire, wind, or rain. And the most recent example I've got is a rain event that we had, where we had a massive rain bomb on the 5th of April earlier this year. Really impacted a lot of our infrastructure, but in particular, it impacted the Megalong Valley. The Megalong Valley, for those that don't know, is a beautiful valley, but there's one road in and one road out. And for all intensive purposes, that road was washed away. So we had lost the only public access into the valley. And it was also made a little bit more challenging by the fact that residents in the valley do span both Blue Mountains Council and Lithgow Council areas, but that was still their only road in and out. I will say that in this regard, I wasn't the lead kind of community recovery person. Blue Mountains Council a while ago had made a conscious decision that that person would be Vicky Edmonds, who deals with our community development area. So I largely play a supportive role, and what we were looking at doing in that regard is really building the capacity in the organisation. So again, Dan talks about collaboration. If we've got more people who can actually do this in the organisation, we really then build the capacity in the organisation as well. And Vicky and I certainly collaborate, extensively on that. So to the point where, within I think 24 hours of it actually happening, Vicky and I were actually on the ground. We'd managed to get over the landslip with some assistance from the engineers, and we actually, walked down virtually into the valley and started to meet with residents down there, obviously trying to find out what their concerns were, trying to find out how we could help, trying to develop that document where we can start to package everything together and go, right, what are the needs of this community? So we're doing the needs assessment as we go. We're also, it was a challenge because there were over 200 visitors in the valley when we lost that road. So one of the first points and major collaboration points that we had to do is we had to negotiate with some landowners, the police and the SES as a lead agency to try and get those people out of the valley. So we were actually going through, private property to enable that to happen. Now, because we'd had such an amount of rain, that was problematic in itself because, you've got some very boggy areas and, the private landowners were very, very concerned with the, any potential damage to their property that could be caused by a whole host of vehicles going through their property. And it was a tricky, route anyway. So yeah, we did have to negotiate that and collaborate with them and have agreements that, the roads and the areas would be completely fixed up. So we were able to do that. And then obviously, because we've got a lot of residents and business owners down there who are pretty isolated, we're then trying to work that out. And there were challenges, including getting food to them, waste management, effluent removal, the gas supplies down there. These are all areas that, they don't have generally things like town water and, they don't have natural gas supplies. It's all through bottled gas. So we're looking at that. It's quite a rural area, so we've got livestock management and movements that we're trying to manage as well. So through a range of different areas there, we were able to assist. We managed to negotiate with the RFS some helicopter lifts into the areas. So that this was a really funny thing. This I think, when we talk about collaboration, it's about building relationships and having people you can turn to, I believe. And, in that regard, I charged some of my other team and I managed the leisure and aquatic centres. And I said, quick, get my credit card, go to the shops, buy as much food as you can, then go to the produce areas, go and buy as much animal feed as you can. And I've got my guys at the animal produce stores phoning me going, what the hell do horses eat? They got no idea. They're managing pools normally, so we're just trying to collaborate and just trying to get as much as we can into the thing, onto the helicopter, so that we can get it lifted into the area. And as I said, you've got to keep that sense of humor sometimes when that's all going on. One of the best things though about the Megalong is, as a rural area, they are quite self-sufficient, and they've got a tea room down there that really became the focal point of what was happening. So when the food was being delivered, we were using that as a distribution point, setting it all up there. We were using that as our base to sit there and listen to people's concerns, and really then starting to work closely with that community. It was also very clear that we had to try and lobby other levels of government to try and get ongoing funding and support. So, we were able to collaborate with the business owners, with the residents to try and, package those documents up, because, everyone wants data to be able to justify any support that they're giving. So that was something that was something we were really working on and collaborating, as I said, closely with that community. So yeah, and it's still going on a little bit at the moment. And I've got to say a massive thank you to a lot of the people that we worked really closely with, people like the Lithgow Council, SES RFS, Service New South Wales. We had the Rural Advisory Mental Health Programme. They walked in with us as well as the Rural Financial Counselling Services. And obviously, we're still dealing largely with the state government in relation to, the ongoing fixes of that area. And the road is open now, although it's got a weight limit on it. But yeah, we are getting more and more into there. So yeah, that's, I think, a good story of and something that required a lot of collaboration through a lot of different multi-agencies, residences, private landowners, business owners, and yeah, something that's still ongoing. So yeah, and then in that regard, Dan, when you think about collaboration, what do you actually mean by collaboration? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. And look, firstly, I'll just say thanks for sharing this story. I think it's such a good example of the type of collaboration that often happens and often works in relief and early recovery. And I think one thing that stands out to me that was just something you mentioned fleetingly was the tea room as a focal point, and the importance of like physical places and spaces for people to be able to gather to work together. In terms of what I mean by collaboration, so this is the only thing I'm going to share in the chat box probably today, and it's a definition that I really like, and I'll just briefly talk through why I like it so much. And so the definition is collaboration is a process through which parties who see different aspects of a problem can constructively explore their differences and search for solutions that go beyond their own limited vision of what is possible. And I really like that for a couple of reasons. So one of them is that it emphasizes that collaboration is a process, it's a relationship, it's not an activity or an action. So, collaboration's not having contact with someone. It's not information sharing, it's this two-way ongoing relationship. I really like the definition because it emphasizes interdependence. So not just regarding the different skills and knowledge and resources that people bring, but also that each party can see different parts of the challenge. And if we're talking about disaster recovery as the thing that we're working together on, different agencies can see different parts of the sort of complex and interconnected nature of the thing that we're doing. And so, for example, a state government agency in recovery is going to be able to see different things more clearly, whereas a small local NGO will be able to see other things. So, for example, a small local NGO will be able to see community need at a local level in a more nuanced and detailed way. And I think that idea of vision and what each party can see is helpful for thinking about collaboration in recovery. And the other reason I like this definition is that it suggests that differences are really key to collaboration. And so collaboration is not about agreeing on everything or trying to homogenize how recovery is done. It's not about making sure everyone does things the same. It's about identifying how we're different. And this isn't about, people being responsible for different domains or being legislated to do different things. It's about our different perspectives and things bigger than that. So
and just on that, Dan, if you've got any insights into it, and it's interesting because I've got some notes here that I was thinking about talking about earlier on about some of the challenges with collaboration, certainly in those early stages when it's quite a fast-paced environment. There's lots of different things flying around. And have you got any insights on how sometimes you can get rid of some of that noise that's there? Because there's obviously lots of different competing things, and actually get to the point of what is actually needed by some of these communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll get into it a little bit more later, but I think it's a really good point about kind of the noise and the distraction of early recovery, and how easy it is to become task focused instead of collaboration focused. And I think the answer is really simple, which is that you need time and space in order to identify need and to collaborate together. And that's not something that can be rushed. It's not something that can be done through shooting off an email. It's something that needs people gathering together, preferably face to face, but online if that is necessary, to be able to cut out that noise. But I think I think there's a few really practical things we can do in early recovery that I think we can chat about a bit later. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing with the definition that I think is important in thinking about collaboration is that, like, true collaboration is voluntary and it's based on kind of mutual respect and equity in the relationship. And I think that is another thing that, when we're thinking about what real collaboration means, is important to emphasize. And so, things like contractual relationships or coordination mechanisms are part of collaboration, but collaboration, something more than that. It's like a relationship over time that
I think that's a really good point as well, because I can remember, obviously in the 13 incident, where we're working closely together, and of course there's an MOU set up between Blue Mountains Council and the Red Cross, and it pretty much went in the bottom of the drawer, never to be seen again. So it's one of those things. You're right, it's all about that mutual trust, and working well together, and yeah, you can have these documented agreements and contracts built up, but you really have to have that same vision that you're all working for a common goal. And yeah, you're right, it's a lot about relationships. So,
definitely.
yeah.
And I think those like formal documents like MOUs or agreements have a role and are important. And often it's the process of developing them that is more useful than the document itself. But not without the relationship and the trust and all of that interpersonal stuff. And thank you for sharing the full reference in the chat box. Nice one, Dan. So my next question for you is, how is Blue Mountain City Council involved in recovery? And what is the importance of collaboration for local government specifically?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. And I think it's funny because you've probably touched on some of that, and we've touched on it already, but the nature, I guess, of how local governments are involved in recovery and that collaboration, it largely varies on the different events. And as I said earlier on, the Blue Mountains, whilst a very beautiful area, we do have our challenges with bushfires, windstorms, flooding, and of course the one that everyone got impacted by, COVID, recently. So it's something that we're always challenged with. Now, in a lot of these instances, local government is not the lead agency going into it, certainly not the lead agency while the emergency is happening, but we kind of morph into that agency that has the ongoing oversight of the community recovery, because we are right at the coalface. We are dealing with our local community. They are right there. They have needs, and we largely know what their needs are, as opposed to a state government agency coming in, or a federal government agency coming in. So yeah, whilst we operate under that kind of state government framework for recovery, it's really important that we've built those those collaborative links with the community, so that we can actually get their needs addressed, and just move forward with that. So what we also do, because we are limited in what we can deliver in in the fact that we were governed, I guess, by, we've got the Local Government Act, and then council develops a community strategic plan, and then we've got a delivery program and an operational plan that, you know, which specifies and is adopted by the council what council is going to deliver in any 4 or 1 year period. So once you've got that in place, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to step outside of that. So quite often what local government is they're the agency that will get the information from our communities about what is needed, and often we have to triage that and then send that to other organizations, and we need to be advocates on behalf of our community as well, in order to get, whether it be funding or whatever, to try and actually help our community to recover in these spaces. And we certainly saw it in the 13 fires, where, you know, we got an amount of funding from the state government that meant we could set up, you know, a recovery office, and we had a number of different positions in that, and we were out there actively trying to help our community in that space. And that doesn't really change from some of the more recent events that we've had. So so yeah.
That's really interesting. So I have kind of a statement and then a question. So one is, I think what you've highlighted for me is, and what you've described really nicely is the operating environment of local government and the different constraints and things that influence local government's role, and just how critical being able to share and understand other agencies' operating environments and constraints is to effective collaboration. But the question that I had to have for you is something that you mentioned really early on about kind of being local government, being a local organisation, and in recovery, different agencies coming in and kind of establishing mechanisms for working together. And I guess my question for you is, what advice would you give, for example, state government when coming in to work with local government in early recovery?
I think in early recovery, it's really good for state government to understand that, you know, in a lot of I'm not going to say for all local governments, because you've got areas like City of Sydney where the vast majority of their, you know, workers come from out of area. Blue Mountains, the vast majority of our workers are local residents. You know, we know the area, we know the different networks. So I think for state government to understand that local government is there, they are part of the community, they know the community, and you know, if we're saying these are needs, it's because we know our community. So, you know, how can state government then come in and thankfully, I think, you know, in most recent events, state government hasn't come in and tried to, you know, be that, you know, roller coaster that's coming over the top of everything. They've actually been quite collaborative in their approach. I think a little bit in the, I guess the 13 fires, the challenge with that was the politics of it. In particular, you know, we had a Liberal state government and we had a Labour local government, so there was always that little bit of a butting of heads together, and I think as officers we have to try and remove ourselves from that and really you know, work with the state government agencies and really try and understand what they're trying to deliver, so that they can understand what we're trying to deliver, and how we can kind of guide them through trying to work with our community the best way possible. Because again, we know our community, we know the things that are going to arc our community up so that they're going to put barriers up, and we know the things that we can try and, you know, smooth the way through. And yeah, I think it is really important to very quickly, it's almost like speed dating, isn't it? You've got to really quickly come up with those relationships with the other state government agencies, and in some regard we've already got some relationships with them, but if you get new people and new agencies come in, yeah, it's that really quick turnaround of understanding who am I dealing with, you know, what are their objectives, what are they trying to get out of this, what do they need to try and deliver, and then yeah, we can try and work that and yeah, build that I guess that build that trust up so that we can work together.
Mm.
Yeah. So did that answer your question?
It did. And like Linda, I really like the speed dating analogy. I think it's very cool.
So the next question I have for you is, what's different about collaborating in disaster recovery than in other environments? And I think we just said the speed dating bit is a
Yeah,
key
definitely.
thing.
So I mean, I think some things are similar, right? The general principles of collaboration are still stand, but I think the speed of things certainly. So time is sort of compressed in early recovery. There's this sort of speed and pressure, and then this kind of long tail end, I guess, where recovery is out of the spotlight. And I think there's a lot of pressure to get things right early on. And obviously things are moving quickly, things have to happen quickly. And so, we have a tendency as organisations, I think, to look inward at those times rather than pausing to think, well, how can we best work together? And I think in those early days where you're just trying to stay afloat, it takes a real conscious effort to pause and to do that speed dating. I think, though, what that can mean, and maybe this is a reflection on longer term recovery, is often that pressure means that recovery agencies, recovery workers from different agencies can form really strong bonds and really strong collaborative relationships with one another that can make things easier. And I'm sure anyone here who has worked in recovery will have formed like really strong professional relationships with the people who they survived the early days of working in recovery with. And I think that can make things easier in some ways. I mean, there's a couple of different, there's so many different things that are different. I think to your previous example, there's agencies from different sectors working together, the economic, the social, the built, government of different levels, NGOs of different sizes, and all of these organisations have different, interests and values and governance. And I don't think this happens in the same way in many other sectors that I know of. And differences then can be really practical, right? So they can, like, even if you're going to think about something like what is a normal meeting for an organisation? Is it formal or informal? Can you just talk, or do you have to wait until you're called upon? Is it the chair's role to facilitate or to coordinate or to manage? And these really simple, really things that we take for granted if we're working within specific sectors or specific types of agencies, we have to navigate and negotiate in recovery. And I think that sometimes the challenges of collaboration come just from like assuming that things work in a certain way when actually they're different between agencies. Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of other things. I'm conscious of time, but I guess I'd also acknowledge that, there's a whole bunch of these kind of myths about recovery, probably from outside the sector, that recovery is something that you fix, that it's linear, that it happens quickly, and they put a lot of pressure on organisations. And we might not believe these things, but it might mean that there's outside pressure, which then makes collaborating difficult because we look to, I guess, inward. So
I think that's a really good point as well, because recovery is so different for every single person going through it. And just as an example, in the Blue Mountains after the 13 fires, we had a number of staff members who were impacted, who then they lost their houses, and one of them said, "Oh, it's the worst thing ever. I don't know what to do, and do I move away from the Blue Mountains?" And then I was talking to another person who also lost their house. Best thing ever happened to me. It was awesome. I got the insurance money and got to build what I actually wanted to build. So people are going through things, and I think that as people working in recovery, we've got to understand that, and also that comes into the collaborating as well, understanding at what different stages people are going at, and it's a very individual thing. So
yeah, certainly. And I think that's, in terms of what that means for collaboration, it means you're dealing with lots of different experiences. And even within the Blue Mountains, every disaster event is different. So,
Yep.
yeah. I think I'm asking you a question now. Yes.
I think so.
Yeah. And this is kind of, I guess, a similar question to what you asked me, but phrased a little bit differently. So feel free to skip over things we've already covered. But the question is, from your experience, what were some of the challenges that you have experienced collaborating in a recovery environment?
Yeah, look, and I think, yeah, interesting, because we've covered a lot of that just in our general chat anyway already. So, and I think, yeah, that fast pace, lots of unknowns initially, trying to unpack what we actually, what is important to focus on. You know, and I mentioned, you know, just, you know, getting through that noise into what we're actually delivering. I think some of the challenges as well is actually trying to slow it down. You mentioned earlier on, Dan, that, you know, trying to slow it down so that you can actually unpack through some of that. But sometimes in those initial stages, it's difficult to slow it down because, you know, you've got so many different priorities that people are hitting you with, trying to say, we need this now. So yeah, if you can get that space, it can be very, very effective to slow it down. We've also got multiple actors and agencies coming in with all different objectives, and some of them we know about and some of them we don't know about. Sometimes, you know, you get a word that there's an agency over here doing something that hasn't linked in with anyone else. So, you know, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? We just don't know about it. So, you know, that's not, obviously they haven't taken a collaborative approach, but we'd like them to link in with us so that we can actually get a better outcome potentially. And I touched on it a little bit earlier on, and the politics of it, you know, working in local government, I'm exposed to it on a regular basis. I have to be, I think what I did and what I discussed with yourself and the team in 13, that I just kind of tried to set myself up is that kind of, you know, defensive block, if you like. I'll deal with all the politics crap side of it, and I'll let you guys just deal with the community and the recovery side. So so yeah, and I think that's important to try and not get bogged down in some of that politics, because if you do, you just end up with a really crappy result for the community. So
yeah, certainly. And I think that's a really interesting observation about the role that many leaders and people in recovery play in terms of trying to create a barrier between the politics and the collaboration.
Yeah. And back over to you. So can you tell us, or what does your research tell us about collaborating in disaster recovery, and how can we implement this in practice?
Yeah, sure. So I will keep this fairly brief because I think that a lot of what the research tells us is fairly intuitive anyway, but I think it's really important to highlight. So what I'll do, I'm going to highlight a few things that regularly come up in the research that result in good collaboration in disaster recovery, and I might provide a bit of an example on how that can be done practically. And I'm going to also type them in the chat box as I talk, just so that you can see them. And so the first one is a shared interest or goal. And so, you know, in this case, you know, the shared goal or interest is the good of the disaster affected community. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that as organisations, we might have secondary interests that are also important. So, you know, even though we try to create a barrier between, for example, politics and the work, it doesn't mean that it's not important, that is irrelevant. And so I think these sort of secondary interests in, you know, being respected, in having the opportunity to participate, in being acknowledged for work are really important to acknowledge, as well as the shared interest or goal. And I think in practice, I think this is just being really open and transparent about the things that are important to our organisation, in addition to the importance of the work and keeping that goal of what is good for disaster affected communities really central. The second thing that comes up really frequently, which you've mentioned a few times already, is trust. And so, you know, this is those trusted relationships built before a disaster. And this means sort of, I guess, going beyond transactional relationships. So in practice, it's really simple things, right? It's like having a coffee together after the committee meeting. It's things like participating in recovery exercises. So those sort of opportunities to gather together for agencies and to interact. It's working together on shared projects outside of a disaster, particularly for, you know, if there are opportunities between like NGOs or and local government, for example. So it's that practicing that helps build trust. A third one that comes up a lot, which we've talked about already as well, is kind of agreements. So those interorganizational structures that I guess are agreements about how we're going to work together. And so these are formal things. And I think, like I already said, it's not really necessarily always the plan that is important, although it has a really critical role in terms of clear responsibilities and agreement, but it's often the process of developing these things that help us to get to know one another. Next one really quickly is role clarity. So being clear on our own role and the roles of others really helps to foster collaboration in recovery. And so this is like our formal roles, you know, obviously in emergency management arrangements, recovery plans, but also the things we can do. So, you know, understanding what skills and knowledge and resources agencies have available to them. And I think things like co-locating really help in terms of learning about one another. And the final thing that comes up quite regularly is autonomy. And so this is the idea that parties are like independent and unique as well as part of a collaborative relationship. So they're, you know, have a unique contribution as well as being part of a group working towards some sort of shared goal or greater good.
Yep.
And so, sorry, you go, Dan.
No, I was just going to ask you the next question, because I noticed you've got 6 questions and I've only got 5 questions. So, you know, but you kind of, I wanted to jump straight onto your next question, because you kind of touched on a little bit of it anyway, which is, you know, how do power imbalances affect collaborations?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So, so there are lots of different types of power, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole today, but in conflict research, which is part of where my PhD comes from, power is generally defined as the ability to get things done, influence outcomes, or achieve desired results. And in recovery, I guess, getting things done does depend strongly on funding and money. And decision-making authority. And so often there are these relationships set up where there's a funder and a funded, there's agencies with formal responsibilities, and there's those who are outside of formal arrangements. And these change. You know, there's power in terms of access to information or data. You know, there's power related to the, you know, even things like who can invite in or exclude certain agencies from formal collaboration mechanisms. So there's all of these things going on which have to do with, I guess, the ability to influence and the ability to have money to do the things that you want to do. And I think these affect collaborative relationships because they change the power relationship. And so so I think I don't think anyone in recovery is sort of deliberately exercising power in nefarious ways. I think we're all acting in good intent, but more just that those dynamics of funder and funded, or decision-making authority and not, can make collaboration in recovery a little bit fraught.
I think one of the key things there around the funding as well, and I think this is why collaboration is so important, is that certainly things that I've seen is, you get funding from the state government, or local government gets funding from the state government, but it's so rigid in what it can be spent on. And as we know, recovery is quite a dynamic space and things change all the time. And then what we were struggling with previously was trying to say, well, actually, this is what we originally said, but now there's an issue over here that we need to address. And, we really couldn't get that buy-in to change the funding so that it would allow us to do that, which is why it's really important that local government can talk to other agencies and try and collaborate to deal with that other issue that's just come up over here. So yeah, that's one of the key things, and why collaboration, in my view, is very, very important.
Yeah. Absolutely. And look, I think there's a lot of things that we can do to form really strong, good collaborative relationships when there are these different power dynamics happening. But I think being conscious of the fact that they do influence how we work together in recovery is really important. And that, if in the process we can develop mutual respect and the ability for people to participate and contribute to decision making, as long as there's transparency, I think there are things we can do to mitigate kind of and offset some of these sort of dynamics, but just that it's important that they're recognised as part of our collaborative efforts.
Yep, absolutely.
I've got another question, which I think is probably like a good final question. I'll ask it in a second. I can see that there are some questions in the chat box regarding resources on power in this context, and I will find some and share them in a minute. But my question for Dan is, how does collaboration help local government to prepare for the next disaster?
Yeah, look, I think this is so important. As I said, we're Blue Mountains, lots of different disasters. I mean, we have in the region of 30 bushfires in the Blue Mountains annually. Obviously not all as severe as some of the ones we faced, but I think it's not if it's going to happen again, it's when it's going to happen again that we're faced with another kind of situation like that. So it's vitally important for us to collaborate and develop those networks, good working networks as well, so that we understand what the needs of the community are. It's understanding the resources that are already out there in our community. We don't need to reinvent the wheel half the time. We don't need to, ship in all these different resources. Sometimes they're sitting there in our community ready to go, and if we can leverage that or get those resources, extra funding to ramp up during that period, then obviously they're already here in the community, and that's going to be of a massive benefit to the community as well. And also that's not just on a community well-being sense, that's also in the kind of economic space as well. We've got business chambers of commerce and things like that set up already. So how do we support the businesses when something like this happens? And as a major tourism destination, we see when we get a fire, it massively impacts the businesses and the economy of the Blue Mountains when that happens. So we need to be able to react to that. But one of the key things, I think, is understanding the pre-existing challenges that we have in our local communities that may be exacerbated by a natural disaster. So if we already understand through collaborating with different agencies, collaborating with our community, what those challenges are, well, we know what to start to focus on as a straight away, if you know what I mean. So and we can only do that because we are local government in our local community, and we're already trying to manage that.
That's really interesting, and I think that idea of kind of collaborating is a preparedness action is really helpful.
Yep.
Interesting.
And I think I've got one last one for you, Dan, as well, which is what kind of considerations need to be made when different sectors or organizational types are collaborating together?
That is a good question. And look, I think we've covered a lot of this already. But I think the first one really is building relationships beforehand. So I think I've mentioned this in a bit of detail, but this doesn't mean you attend the same meetings. It means you practice collaborating together. So that might be through exercises, through working on projects, through anything. So I think that building relationships beforehand and how that contributes to trust, to understanding one another is really important. And that's not always possible, right? Sometimes that speed dating is a necessary, inevitable part of recovery. But if not, then definitely. I think the second one is taking time to get to know one another's operating environments. And I think this links back to some of your previous descriptions of kind of politics and the plans and the constraints that you operate within. And I think understanding things like how do different agencies, what are they accountable for? How are decisions made? What political pressures do you face? Like those things are really helpful in terms of agencies seeking to collaborate together. Because I think some of the time things that feel like, duplication or feel like gaps are because you don't see the full picture. And I think that kind of act of helping one another to see as much of the system as possible is an important part when different sectors and different organisations are collaborating together. And I think the final thing would be just be curious. So, if an agency sees a gap where you don't, then ask why. Is it because there's a gap or because there needs to be improved coordination or communication between people? So I think that sort of act of being able to step back and ask, well, why is this happening? How can we do it better? Is a really important part of collaborating better together. And look, I think I could talk about this for the rest of the day. So I'm going to pause because I'm conscious that we're almost at question and answer time. But thanks for having a chat, Dan.
No, thank you, Dan.
I honestly could sit and listen to you guys all day. I'm learning so much. There's a few questions in the Q&A, which I'll jump to in a sec, but because I've got the floor, I've got one that I'm desperate to ask. And that's, you're talking about the need for slowing things down, time, the complexities of figuring out what horses eat, helicoptering in food, gas, etc., all in this really high pressure environment, where what Danielle, you were saying was around the existing issues within the community get exacerbated, and this need to kind of get, calm down some of the noise. If you need to build relationships in that environment, and I know, Danielle, you were talking about doing that beforehand, what are some things that, I'm just thinking the ability to be able to collaborate and bring your best self when you're probably really tired and dealing with the Obama problems. What are some things, organizations and workers can do, to ensure that they can do that?
I think from my point of view, some of the things initially and very early on is when there are some of those emerging and immediate needs, if you can address them straight away, you start to build trust within that community, because then they see someone, oh, we asked for this and it happened quite quickly. So then you start to understand who in the community you can trust, and you can start to get the proper feedback from. You do have to be a little bit careful from that as well, because you can't start, they can't then come and say, oh, we want all this extra stuff, and but yeah, if you can deliver on some of those real immediate needs, like the things like the food, like the things like the animal feed, which is what we were able to do. We were able to be down, this is using the Megalong Valley experience. We were in the Megalong Valley. We were talking to the community. We were hearing what their immediate needs were. We fed that back up the chain, and then we got the helicopter drops with the food and the animal feed. So they're starting to see, oh, hang on a minute, they're listening to us. So you start to develop those relationships, and that's where you can sit down and as Dan said, using the tea rooms as that central base. We were sat there, they knew what my order of tea was at the end of the day. I'm not a coffee drinker, so they always knew as I was walking in, oh, Dan, English breakfast tea? Yep, no worries. So but developing those relationships straight away, and you start to build that trust, because I'll tell you now, there's still a lack of trust in council with the fact that road failed, but there's not, we got a massive thank you for the stuff that we were able to deliver to keep that community going. So, you've got different kind of areas. And I think because council's such a, huge beast, and providing a whole range of different services, you've got different areas, and you're trying to build trust through one area, so you can feed information through another.
I think I'd add two things to that. I think the first one's sort of been alluded to already, and that is try to work next to one another. Like if you're both really busy, just try and work in the same room together. And whether that's depending on the arrangement, whether that's an RECC or whether that's a whatever, like just work together next to one another. And I think that those really practical things actually make a really big difference, particularly in that early frantic phase. And I think the other thing that can be really helpful is by valuing collaboration, like delegate that to someone. You're the collaborator, you're the one whose job it is to get out there and work with other agencies. And obviously we all do that as part of our roles, whether you're kind of outward facing or you're looking at the logistics. But I think valuing it by telling someone it's their job is one good way of doing that.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, I thought this would probably be a good one to touch on the back of my question from Sharon. And that's about distinguishing between needs and wants in the community. So as people working with community, Dan Long, you're talking about get some of those early wins to build trust. How do you determine between wants and needs?
That's always a tricky one, isn't it? But I mean, when we talked earlier on about, that immediate kind of airlift, and I think we did 3 airlifts all in all, so we could very quickly establish, of course, food is an immediate need. Of course, animal feed is an immediate need. You've got places down there running, horses, cattle, everything like that. So we also here at council, we had a crisis management team. So whilst, there were a number of officers, including myself, in the Megalong Valley talking to the community, we would meet first thing in the morning with the crisis management team, and we would put up everything that we had heard, and we were able to start to unpack that, and then start to address some of those immediate needs. Also, again, developing that trust with members of the community down there as well. So you might be hearing one thing from one person, and then you can go and talk to someone who you've built up a bit of a rapport with and say, hey, we're hearing this. you know, we hear this is a really big need, and they go, what are you talking about? No one needs that down here. So you start to be able to unpack that with different members of the community. And again, it's about those relationships. It's always about relationship building and trying to get the best out of that.
Yeah, yeah. Danielle, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I mean, I guess the only thing that I'd add is, aside from kind of the meeting of basic needs in early relief and early recovery, often wants in the longer term are really about what people are saying is good for them. And so I don't know that in the longer term that distinction is as easy to make, because it's really a question of community or agency saying this is what would be good for us now, rather than that distinction between needs and wants.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I just had the other question up. Sorry, I've lost it. Okay, so this is from Laurie Pierce. A couple of months ago, the community of Jasper in Alberta, Canada, lost a third of its homes and businesses, with 400 to 800 buildings, and many have lost their jobs and homes. There are extremely limited options for housing available. A Jasper Recovery Committee is being set up. Do you have three key lessons as priorities for this committee? And I just want to, this is for the community of Jasper, not the communities in northern Queensland impacted by Cyclone Jasper. So I guess, three key lessons for recovery committees on setting them up for collaboration. Yes.
I think whilst always challenging, try and keep the politics out of it. That's, and that was one of the struggles I think we had with the recovery committee that was set up here in the Blue Mountains through the 13 fires, is that that the politicians got involved, and you had to kind of try and wade through some of that. So if you can do that, and also it's not always the loudest voice with the greatest needs. So you've got to quite often you get a lot of loud people come up, and they will say, yes, this is what we need, but then there's some more considered people who don't just have that personality. So it's trying to understand them, and maybe there's a bit of a recruitment process that you need to go through and vet some of those people before you actually have them on there. What value are you going to bring to this committee? What experiences do you have? That's two I've got. I don't know if Dan, you've got anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, probably like just similar things. I'm going to go with the 3 because I like a number. And the first one, and I don't think these answers are any different to what I would be saying if it was a different context, apart from acknowledging that the impact of that event is significant, and
massive.
With setting up something like a committee obviously affects people's ability to attend in person, the amount of travel time that committee members have to spend, and all of those things need to be considered in terms of ensuring people can attend and participate. But I think the 3 things are be really clear on the purpose. Like, is this a recovery committee that's being set up for the purpose of consultation? Does it have decision-making authority? Is it expected to be representative of community or a conduit to community? And I think those questions around purpose are sometimes assumed, but need to be made really clear. I think the second one would be take time to talk about decision-making, about process. So how will we communicate? How would we prefer to communicate? How are decisions going to be made? And that sort of stuff feels like it takes up time when there are tasks to be done and business to do. But I think that time to set up processes and agreements for how you work together is really important. And I think the third point probably relates to Dan's comment on representation and ensuring you're never going to be able to get, well, it's really difficult to get a committee that is representative of all groups in the community, but having that lens of who is this group speaking on behalf of, and how can we make sure that if this is a group that is making decisions about the future of a community, that everyone in that community gets the opportunity to contribute.
That works really well with the next question. So collaborating with the community and local businesses, how do you ensure that all or the majority of voices are heard within that community? So given those challenges you just talked about, Danielle, how do you make sure as many voices are heard? Like, what are some practical things around making sure everyone gets heard?
It's always, look, it's always, I think, quite difficult, and as Dan alluded to, you know, it's understanding your purpose and understanding your committee. Who are they representing? You know, and are there others out there that also have a voice? And it could be something as simple as, you know, whilst you've got recovery committees set up, there's other avenues to get information through as well. You know, who are your key points of contact? Where are your key points of contact? You know, we mentioned the tea rooms down at the Megalong earlier on. You know, that's not a recovery committee set up. That's just a key point of contact where people are coming, they're talking, you know, so that if we can leverage off of that to try and find out some more information, yeah, you'd be crazy not to put an officer in that environment to try and work with that community. So yes, whilst you've got a recovery committee as one avenue, don't discount the other avenues of where you can get the information from as well.
Yeah, and I'd just add to that, like, ask your community engagement people. They'll know, you know, and I think there's a whole range of different tools and methods that you can use aside from committees to get community input into recovery decision-making. And some of them exist already. So, you know, I guess the first question for me is what mechanisms are already in place for engaging with community regarding needs and how they input into and lead recovery. But then also just simply like, there are people, particularly in larger organizations, there are people for whom this is their work. You know, how do you engage with community and get their input in different ways that ensure kind of broad representation and opportunity to participate?
Fabulous. Someone's also said apply the principles of the ladies in the tea room. So I'm going to kind of blend two questions here. I think you guys have led really well into, but there's a couple of questions sort of around how do you plan for recovery, and looking at, you know, in between, you know, for lack of a better word, in peacetime, how you can and build that planning for the longer term recovery. For local, there's a specific question for local governments, and how might that differentiate from emergency management approaches? There's a lot in there, so tell me if I need to unpick that a bit.
Could you unpick it? Sorry, can you repeat that again?
I don't know what I'm saying. I guess you talked about the need to tap into what already exists for community engagement. So I guess let's just break it down for now into planning for recovery and planning for long-term recovery, and what are some approaches for doing that sort of in peacetime?
Yeah, so I think, you know, certainly from a local government point of view, and certainly for a local government like Blue Mountains Council, we'd be crazy not to plan for the future. You know, so we do have a continuity business plan here at Blue Mountains Council. We spend quite a lot of time reviewing that, and it does go through a range of different scenarios of different things that can happen. So and we seem to have been through it all recently with COVID and wind, rain, fires. So you know, we're quite well practiced here. As I said, it was mentioned earlier on that, or I think you mentioned it, Erin, that in our organisation we developed a recovery, a preparedness toolkit. So when the next one happens, how do we, you know, flick the switch and we move straight into recovery? And again, I think the collaboration piece on this is so important, because it's not just us, it's the other organizations out there who we link in with. As Dan was saying, you know, your community development officers will know who's out there. We're really fortunate in the mountains. We've got the Mountains Community Resource Network, MCRN, Chris Newton heading that up. You know, that brings together a whole range of different resources in that community sector that, you know, we can work very, very closely with. We also, as I mentioned earlier on, made a conscious decision in the organization not to have me as a recovery manager into the future, but to have Vicky Edmonds, who heads up our community development area, because that again is a capacity building exercise. You've now got two of us in the organization who can do that. I saw someone mentioned up here about the, you know, the ongoing being in constant kind of emergency, you know, scenarios and recovery, and just the pure exhaustion from that. So at least now we've got Vicky, you know, spearheading that. If she wants to go on leave, I can take over. When she gets back, I can go on, you know, so we build that capacity so we're not completely, you know, working on the smell of an oily rag, if you like. So, which could quite often can happen. So, so yeah, I hope that answers some of that question.
Yeah. Did you want to add anything, Danielle?
No, look, I think Dan's pretty much covered the notes that I was scribbling. So, I mean, I think there's, you know, if we're thinking about planning for recovery, there's a couple of things. There's the governance and the arrangements, like the formal stuff in place. There's the plans and the tools. So Dan mentioned a couple of those, like having the documents and the tools that help you out, the bits of paper that provide you with something that is helpful. I think there's the capacity of people, and I think Dan described that really well in terms of ensuring capacity across the organisation, not just centred in an individual role or person. There's the relationships. So like we've talked about, that's sort of the topic of today, I guess. And then the final one, which we've talked about today as well, is the practicing working together, whether that's through, and I know I've been banging on about recovery exercises a bit, but like the actually practicing things together is part of planning. So, you know, planning's not just the plan, it's all of these other things as well.
Yeah, I like that. And I guess in the sense of the actually practicing, ADA have some really good toolkits, the recovery exercise toolkits. So hopefully someone can probably find that and pop it in the chat. So that's a good kind of ready to go and use tool. I guess in the sense of you know, having multiple people and building capacity within organizations, having those pieces of paper, etc. I'm interested to know, and this is a question from Linda McCabe, have you seen any models that facilitate connection and collaboration when services are scaling down and that they might be at different timelines. So, you know, recovery transition, exit planning, that type of thing, different organizations, you know, finishing up their funding, other organizations coming in. Have you seen that done? You know, different models and the strengths and challenges for some of that.
I've seen it done. I'm not going to say I've always seen it done well. Usually it's all of a sudden like, oh, where's that gone? So yeah, I think it is an important thing to note, and certainly in you know, local government, we quite often get funding for a position for a certain amount of time. So it's our challenge then to build into BAU, you know, what that position was doing, and we hope that by the time the funding for that position has ended, we are in a sufficient space for that BAU to be able to take place. So yeah, but it is a challenge.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And like Dan, like I don't know that a particular model comes to mind apart from not apart from planning for it. You know what I mean? And I know that the term exit planning isn't ideal, but for lack of a better word, that sort of working as part of a collaborative partnership to talk about, well, this agency is going to be wrapping up in 3 months. You know, currently they chair this committee and they're the best point of contact for people who live here or who are reliant on, I don't know, food relief. Like, let's talk about how we're going to make sure that this isn't dropped and this is integrated into BAU. So I don't think a particular plan or model comes to mind, more the principle of like talk about it and plan for it early and like don't just drop it. Yeah.
So I guess like keep those collaboration principles in the transition planning, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. I guess we've got one last time for one last sort of quick question. I guess really quickly, there's a question around, you know, talking about planning and planning for recovery, planning for long-term recovery, and planning for transitions or exits. What about the buy-in and, you know, preparing for a future event? I know someone put in the chat that it's Emergency Ready Week, so I have to shamelessly plug that from Australian Red Cross. But you know, what's your advice to getting some buy-in from communities who haven't experienced a disaster event previously?
That's really difficult because you don't really know until you've gone through one, until you've been, you know, dealing with people who have lost their house or even worse. You know, it can be, people can be very blasé about it, which is, you know, yeah, can be a little bit worrying. So, but I think the only thing you can do in that space is link into the networks that are already in those communities and be repetitive. You've got to be repetitive in this space. You know, you've got to have those tools that you repetitively get out there. So it almost becomes, you know, second nature in my view. But it can be difficult when people haven't gone through, or communities haven't gone through any of that kind of yeah, and any kind of emergencies in that space. So I don't, yeah.
Yeah, and look, I think it's sort of not really collaboration related, I guess, but I guess it's keeping in mind that the compelling argument might not be related to disaster preparedness. It might be related to something else. And if a community hasn't experienced a disaster and perceive that their risk is low, then some disaster preparedness activities, most of them, have other benefits other than being prepared for a disaster. So, you know, if the compelling argument is to be better connected to your community because that's just inherently a good thing, then that is also an act of preparing for a disaster, even though people may not identify it in that way.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I guess it's the collaborating and the planning beforehand, whether it's for sand, snow, wind, or something maybe more personal. Like the act of bringing people together and collaborating is probably just as important for emergency planning. Yeah. I just want to say I could keep listening to you guys for another 2 hours. But I just want to say thank you so much for volunteering your time with us today on behalf of AIDA and Australian Red Cross. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for your awesome questions. An email will be sent to you with today's recording from today's session. And when you exit today's Zoom, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. This helps us get information for what events will be useful in the future and helps us plan for future ones. Again, thank you all, and I hope you can all go back to your, day job and think about how you can use some of the principles for collaborating in your work supporting communities. Thank you, Dan Long, and thank you, Dan O'Hara.